In this lesson, we're going to take a look at adding, editing, and deleting data using our product router. The objectives for this lesson are to add methods to the repository class in order to modify data. So we're going to update router methods to use those modification methods in our repository class. Let's jump right into our first demo, which we're going to add modification methods to our IRepository interface. And then, of course, we have to modify our product repository class to implement each one of those methods. Open the IRepository CS file, and let's add a few more methods. So we added a insert, an update, a set values, and a delete method. Next, open the repository layer folder and open the product repository, and you'll notice the little squiggly here on the IRepository interface. The reason why is because we need to implement the insert, the update, the set values, and the delete methods. So let's come all the way down here to the bottom, and let's add in each of these new methods. You can see on lines 42 through 45 a stub for an insert method that's going to insert a new product entity object. We have a stub for an update method on lines 49 through 52 that also is going to pass in a product entity object. And now think about the update for a minute. If they don't pass everything in that entity, right? If they don't pass every single property, we might want to be able to fix that up a little bit by grabbing data from the current record that's in the product table and compare that with what they did pass in. So within the update, we're going to call this method called set values. Inside of here, we will compare to see what's in the changes. If what's in the changes, like the name property, for instance, if what's in there is null or white space, that means the user did not pass in that value. So let's go ahead and take the current name and put it into that current name. Otherwise, we will take the changes if they did pass something. And then for each product property, we'll do the same type of logic. Now, this isn't bulletproof. You might want to really think about how you do this, or maybe you just require all data to be passed by the user. Then you wouldn't need a method like this. But I put it in here just so we have all of the changes we need. The last one on lines 82 through 85 is a stub for our delete method. And we're then going to build each one of these throughout this particular lesson. Let's now take a look at adding the insert method to the product repository class. So let's go up and let's fill in the code we need to perform the insert using the entity framework. So if we take a look here, we can see the first thing I'm going to do is fill in some required fields that maybe aren't passed by the client. Even if they are, we're going to go ahead and fill them in ourselves. And that's the row good, which is a unique ID, and a modified date. I want to set it to datetime.now. You might consider using datetime.utc now instead. Add a new entity to the products DB set by doing the add method and passing in that entity that got passed into the insert method. And then, of course, invoke the save changes method on our DB context. We want to return the entity because it may have some things that got filled in by SQL Server, such as the product ID, right? If it's got an identity, it's going to increment that identity property and it fills it into our entity. Now that the repository class is updated, let's update our product router class, and we're going to also need to update our router base class as well. Next, let's open our product router class, and we're going to add at the bottom a protected method that's going to be called by our app.mapPost. And it's an insert method to which we're going to pass in the new product that the user is trying to insert, and then, of course, our repository. And what we're going to do is on line 90, we're going to serialize the entity. So if you remember, that just takes it and puts it into a property, and we'll see why in just a minute. We then have a try catch. So we first check to see if the entity is not equal to null. Maybe the user didn't pass anything. If it is equal to null, you can see on lines 101 through 105, I'm going to inform the user that they passed a bad entity to the post method, and then we'll return a 400 bad request, and then we'll log that information. If they did pass a valid entity, we're now going to attempt to update the database. So repo.insert, and then we're going to go ahead and create a new record to pass back. So we do the results.created, passing in as the first parameter the product ID. That's the new ID and how to get to it. So we use our URL fragment, and passing in after the slash the product ID. And then, of course, you still pass the full entity back as well. Next, in the catch block, you see a red squiggly. We'll fix that up in just a second. But what I want to do is build an info message that describes to the user what happened if something goes wrong. I'm also going to, on line 115 here, I'm going to build this error log message, which is used in the handle exception method in our base class to log the message. So as you can see what I do here, I do a product router.insert exception trying to insert a new product, and then I pass in that entity as JSON. Remember, that's the serialized version of the object. And then the handle exception, of course, returns the 500. Now let's call this new protected method by going up here and adding a new app.map_post. And you can see what it's going to do is get the URL fragment. It's passing in the product entity, the IRepository, of course. And then it produces a 201. It produces a product object. It could also produce a 400, right, if there was a bad request. And it could also produce a 500. Let's now fix up that squiggly on the settings. What we're going to do is go up to our router base class. And we're going to add in a new protected read-only AdventureWorks API defaults. So we're going to use those settings quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and have that injected here. So I'll do the AdventureWorks API defaults. I'll call it settings. And then here I'm going to go ahead and do settings equals settings. So it's being passed in. Now, the problem is that right now, if we go back to product router and we take a look, you can see we've got a squiggly because it's saying, hey, wait a minute, I need this AdventureWorks API default. So we simply need to add this to the constructor and then pass it down as the second parameter here to our router base. If you were trying to compile right now, you will see that the build fails because we now have to do that to all the other routers that we created as well. We need to add this second parameter and pass it as the second parameter to the base constructor. I'm not going to go through and show you all of that. I'm going to do it off camera and then we'll come back. So you can see that I went into each one and I simply changed the constructor to make sure it has that API defaults coming in now to every constructor. Let's go ahead and run this now and try out our insert method. So we'll come down. We now see the post here on the product route. If I click on to try it out, it shows you the request body. Now, you'd have to fill all of this in with appropriate data. I'm going to go ahead. I've got one already created here, and I'm going to put that in. So I've got the name, I've got the product number, I've got the color, standard cost, and I'm going to go ahead and click on execute here. And if everything happens okay, we should get our 201. We also see the new response body, and you can see the new product ID. That's what got inserted. So this is showing you that everything did work correctly. And if we take a look, we go over to SQL Server, we can see the product did indeed get inserted at the very end of our product table. Let's now take a look at adding the update method to our product repository class and updating our router class as well to make the call to the update. Open the product repository class and modify the update to look like the following. On line 62, fill in the modified date. Again, you might want to use datetime.utc now. You then do a dbcontext.products.update, passing in that entity. It now updates your DB set, and then calling save changes on your DB context, of course, sends that to the database for updating the record down there. Open up the product router, and again, at the very bottom, let's add a new method called update. We pass to the update the ID, the product entity, and of course the repository object. We do the same thing we did in the insert. We serialize the entity so that we have that serialized entity. And within the try catch, check to see if the entity is not equal to null. If it's not equal to null, it's attempt to locate the data. So this gives us our current record. We can then call our repo.setValues, passing in the current record, right? So what's out in the table right now, plus what the user has passed in. That's the one that then checks those different values and makes sure we have valid data. So hopefully we've got everything now. So now we can simply attempt to update the database by doing current equals repo.update, passing in current, because in the set values we set that current. And then we can pass back a 200 OK if everything went correctly. If we didn't find the data, right? So if we can't find the product ID that they're attempting to update, we need to return a 404 because it means somebody probably deleted the record in between the time that they retrieved it and now that they're updating it. And just like we did with the insert, if the entity they pass in is null, then we're going to return a 400 bad request. And the exception looks exactly the same as what we did in the insert, but we now use the put as the verb on line 171. Let's now go back up to our add route method and add our app.mapPut. And you can see that this one, we get the ID, we get the entity, we get the repository, and look at all the produces on this one. We got a 200 with the product, we have the 400, the 404, or a 500. And of course, if we come over here to SQL Server, you can see down at the very bottom there, there's our new values. Change the product. I think I changed it from black to red, and the standard cost and list price changed as well. Let's now add the delete method to our product repository class and then update our product router as well to call that method. Let's now take a look at the delete method. If you open the product repository, fill in where we had stubbed before the delete method, fill it in with this code. On line 103, we first attempt to find the ID that we're attempting to delete. If we don't get anything back, then we're going to return a false. Otherwise, if we get something back, entity will not be equal to null. So we can now do the dbcontext.products.remove on that entity that we got back, call save changes, which deletes it in our table, and then return a true. Let's now open our product router. Let's go to the very bottom and let's insert one more protected method here that we pass in an ID to and the repo. You can see within the try catch, we've got the if repo.delete. So that's where it goes out, checks to find it, and then deletes it. And if everything comes back okay, we return a 204 no content. Now that's the correct one. A lot of people use 200. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but 204 is what you should be using for a delete. If we don't find it, we're going to do an info message that says can't find the product ID to delete, and we'll return a 404 with that message. Down in the exception, it looks exactly the same as what we had in the insert and the update methods. Let's now go up and find the add routes. And let's go ahead and add an app.mapDelete. And again, you can see I'm passing in the ID and the repo, and then we've got different produces here. And if we've done everything correctly, we should be able to run this. We click on delete. We try it out. If you remember, it was the 1000 here, and then we hit the execute. And we can see we get a 204, which means everything got deleted as we expected. In this lesson, we added all the data modification methods to our repository class, and then we added our post, put, and delete routes that call all those different modification methods, so we have a complete add, edit, delete system now. Coming up next, let's talk about validating data.